President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy reached a bipartisan deal to raise the debt ceiling by $2.5 trillion, enough to cover the government's spending until December 2024, after weeks of tense negotiations and brinkmanship. This was a historic achievement that averted an unprecedented default on the nation's debt and ensured economic stability for millions of Americans. The deal, which Biden signed into law on Saturday, also included some modest spending cuts and policy changes that both parties agreed to. For example, the deal capped non-defense discretionary spending at current levels for the next 2 years, rescinded some unspent COVID relief funds, and reformed the environmental permitting process. The deal also shifted some funding away from the IRS, which had received an extra $80 billion over 10 years in last year's Inflation Reduction Act to crack down on tax evasion by the wealthy. The White House said this would not affect the IRS's ability to collect more revenue in the long term. The deal was a rare display of bipartisanship in a deeply divided Congress, where Republicans had initially refused to cooperate with Democrats on raising the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is a legal limit on how much the government can borrow to pay its bills, and it has to be raised periodically to avoid default. The default would have had catastrophic consequences for the economy, as it would have disrupted payments for Social Security, Medicare, military salaries, and interest on the debt. It would have also triggered a global financial crisis, as investors would lose confidence in the U.S. as a safe haven for their money. Biden and McCarthy managed to overcome their differences and strike a deal that satisfied both sides. Biden said the deal was a win for Americans and a proof of his ability to keep the nation on track. McCarthy said the deal was historic because it cut spending for the first time in over a decade. The deal also resolved the debt ceiling issue through the 2024 election, leaving it to the next president and Congress to deal with it again. However, there are still some challenges ahead for both parties, as they have to agree on how to allocate money under the new spending caps and pass annual appropriations bills before October 1st. One of the most significant aspects of the debt ceiling deal is that it imposes limits on federal spending for the next 2 fiscal years. This means that many domestic programs will see little or no increase in funding, while some will face cuts. The deal holds non-defense spending in 2024 at roughly its 2023 level and increases it by 1% in 2025, in part by redirecting funding from other programs. For example, the agreement would cut about $10 billion out of the $80 billion that President Biden previously secured to help the IRS go after wealthy tax cheats, and would use that money to preserve domestic programs that otherwise would have been cut. Another controversial part of the deal is that it changes the rules for some social safety net programs, such as SNAP and TNF. SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, provides food assistance to low-income households. TNF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, provides cash aid to poor families with children. The deal would tighten restrictions for these programs by expanding work requirements and time limits for people without children up to age 54 to receive food assistance through SNAP if they do not complete certain work requirements. Under current law, those time limits only apply to people up to 49 years old. These new limits will sunset, and Democrats secured some exemptions for homeless people and veterans. But many progressives are unhappy with this concession and argue that it will hurt millions of vulnerable Americans who rely on these benefits. On the other hand, the deal also includes some provisions that both parties can celebrate, such as a streamlined process for energy permitting. This means that the federal government will speed up the approval of pipelines and other energy infrastructure projects that are often delayed by environmental reviews and lawsuits. The proposal is raising concerns among Democrats that it could gut the federal Environmental Protection Law, but energy advocates support the change and say it will create jobs and reduce dependence on foreign oil. Republicans also hailed this provision as a win for their constituents who work in the energy sector or live in states that produce oil and gas. These are some of the key elements of the debt ceiling deal that President Biden and Speaker McCarthy struck over the weekend. The deal will not only resolve the high-octane dispute over debt and spending issues that has gripped Washington for weeks, but also enact important changes in environmental permitting, work requirements for social safety net programs, and IRS tax enforcement. The deal still needs to be approved by Congress before it becomes law, but both leaders expressed confidence that they have enough support from their parties to pass it before the June 5th deadline, when the Treasury Department would run out of money to pay its bills. The deal that Biden signed into law on Saturday was a major achievement for his presidency. It ended months of political brinkmanship over the debt ceiling, which threatened to plunge the U.S. economy into chaos. The deal was widely supported by both parties in Congress, with only a few dissenters from the progressive and conservative wings, and it was hailed as a win for Biden's leadership and pragmatism. The deal included several provisions that satisfied both Democrats and Republicans. It suspended the debt ceiling until 2025, avoiding another showdown before the next presidential election. It also set spending caps for the next 2 years, limiting the growth of military and non-military spending. It rescinded some unspent COVID relief funds, reduced some IRS funding, and reinstated work requirements for some welfare programs. It also streamlined environmental regulations to speed up project approvals. The deal was a compromise that reflected the reality of divided government. Biden had to give up some of his spending priorities and accept some policy changes that he opposed. But he also secured enough funding for his key initiatives, such as infrastructure, climate change, and social programs. He also prevented a default that could have damaged his credibility at home and abroad. The deal showed that Biden could work across the aisle and deliver results for the American people. It also showed that Congress could act responsibly and cooperatively when faced with a crisis. The deal was a rare moment of bipartisanship in a polarized political environment.